They told him he was an orphan with nothing to his name, but what he found in the old barn would unravel a lifetime of lies. If you've ever felt like the world had already written your story for you, stick around because this one's for you. And if it hits home, maybe subscribe and become part of a community that gets it. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to exist, at least for the state of Illinois. For 18 years, I was Leo Ward, year 734, a file in a cabinet, a line item in a budget. On the morning of my birthday, I became just Leo, a kid in a worn-out jacket holding a cardboard box with everything I owned, 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times, and a toothbrush. Mrs. Gable, the director of the St. Jude's Home for Boys, stood at the door, her expression a careful mixture of pity and impatience. It was a look I knew well. It was the face of the system itself. The state provides a final stipend of $500 to assist with your transition, she said, handing me a thin envelope. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. She'd given this speech dozens of times. It's been deposited into an account we set up for you. The debit card is inside. I took it. My hand didn't shake, but I felt a tremor deep in my bones, a vibration of pure, unadulterated terror. Is that it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know what I expected. A hug, a handshake, a word of advice. She gave me none of those. Instead, she sighed and reached into her desk drawer, pulling out a small, tarnished brass key tied to a frayed piece of twine. It was heavy, ornate, and looked ancient. This was left for you, she said, her tone suggesting it was an annoyance, a piece of forgotten paperwork she was glad to be rid of. When you were brought in as a baby, your grandfather, we believe. There was no note, just this. It's for a barn, according to the tag. I looked at the small, faded paper tag. The words were barely legible, smudged by time. For Leo, the barn. Below it, an address in a town I'd never heard of, Havenwood. A barn, I said, the word feeling foreign and absurd in my mouth. There's nothing else, no property, no letter. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin, firm line. The records are clear. The property associated with this was foreclosed on years ago for back taxes. The state seized it. It was sold off. The barn is likely just a shell on someone else's land now. Honestly, Leo, the key is probably useless, a sentimental piece of junk, but it was left in your name, so it's yours. A piece of junk, the words echoed in the sterile silence of her office. My entire inheritance. The sum total of my family's legacy was a useless key to a building that no longer belonged to me, on land I could never claim. I felt a familiar hollowness spread through my chest, the cold ache of being utterly and completely alone. I'd spent my life trying not to hope. Hope was dangerous in a place like St. Jude's. It was the thing that broke you when it inevitably evaporated. But for a fleeting second, holding that heavy key, a tiny, stupid spark had ignited. A barn, a place, something real, and just as quickly she had extinguished it. Okay, I said, my voice as flat as hers. I slipped the key into my pocket, the cold metal a small, hard weight against my leg. Thank you? She nodded, her duty done. Good luck, Leo. She didn't walk me to the door. I walked myself out of her office, down the long, polished hallway that had been the backdrop to my entire life, and pushed open the heavy front doors of St. Jude's. The city air hit me, thick with exhaust fumes and the smell of rain on hot pavement. For the first time, there was no one to tell me when to come back inside. There was no curfew. There was no bed waiting for me. There was nothing. Just the $500, the box in my arms, and a rusty key to nowhere. I stood on that sidewalk for a long time, watching the traffic rush by, each car filled with people going somewhere. To homes, to families, to lives I couldn't imagine. My own life felt like a blank page, And I didn't even have a pen. I could get a room at a cheap motel, start looking for a job washing dishes, and try to build something from the absolute zero I'd been given. That was the sensible path. That was the path of survival. But my hand kept drifting to my pocket, to the solid, unyielding shape of the key. A piece of junk. Maybe. But it was the only thing anyone had ever intentionally left for me. It was a thread, however thin, back to a time before I was 734, to a grandfather I'd never known, to a place called Havenwood. My mind was made up before I even realized I was making a decision. I walked to the nearest bus station, the cardboard box digging into my arms. The terminal was a chaotic symphony of announcements, crying babies and rolling suitcases. It smelled of diesel and disinfectant. I looked up at the departures board, a flickering list of destinations that all seemed like they belonged to other people's lives. I found the counter and pushed my new debit card across to the tired-looking woman behind the glass. "1 ticket to Havenwood," I said. She typed for a moment, then looked at me over her glasses. "Havenwood? Son, there's not much out there. It's a changeover in Rockford and then a local line that runs twice a day. You sure?" I nodded, the certainty of it surprising even me. "I'm sure." I had $500 to my name. I had no plan. I was chasing the ghost of a foreclosed property with a key that was probably worthless. It was the stupidest thing I could possibly do, and it was the only thing that felt like it mattered. As I sat on the hard plastic bench waiting for my bus, I took the key out again. The metal was worn smooth in some places, pitted with rust in others. It was a key that had been used. It had turned a lock, opened a door. It was a beginning and an end. It was a promise and a lie. It was everything I had. The bus ride was a slow-motion transition from one world to another. The concrete and glass of the city bled into sprawling suburbs, then into the flat, endless plains of the Midwest. The landscape was a watercolor painting of greens and browns under a vast, empty sky. I watched the power lines dip and rise, hypnotized by their rhythm. For the first time, I felt the sheer scale of the world outside the brick walls of the orphanage. It was terrifying, but it was also clean. The air coming through the cracked window of the bus didn't smell of bleach and institutional soap. It smelled of damp earth and cut grass. It was the smell of something alive. I spent hours staring out that window, my reflection a ghostly overlay on the passing scenery. In the reflection, my face was pale, my eyes too big. I looked like what I was, a kid pretending to be an adult, running on nothing but a gut feeling. The $500 stipend felt like a fortune and nothing at all. It was a lifeline that was already fraying. Every mile the bus traveled, I imagined $1 burning away. The ticket, a bottle of water, the sandwich I'd buy at the changeover in Rockford. How long could it last? A week? 2? What would I do when it was gone? The fear was a constant cold knot in my stomach. At St. Jude's, my life had been prescribed. Wake up at 6, breakfast at 6:30, school, chores, dinner, lights out, a life of bells and schedules. There was no freedom, but there was also no uncertainty. I always knew where my next meal was coming from. Out here, the silence was deafening. The lack of structure felt like floating in a dark ocean with no land in sight. I clutched the key in my pocket. It was my anchor, my compass, my folly. I thought about the grandfather I never knew. Who was he? Why did he leave me a key but nothing else? Mrs. Gable's words circled in my head. Foreclosed, sold off, useless. Was he a man who failed? A man who lost everything and left his grandson with a final bitter reminder of that failure? Or was there something more to it? The questions were a swarm of bees in my mind, and I had no answers. I was chasing a story I didn't know, a history that had been erased. The changeover in Rockford was a brief, jarring return to noise and crowds. I bought a stale ham and cheese sandwich and another bottle of water, feeling the pinch of every cent spent. The second bus was smaller, older, and smelled of mildew. There were only a handful of other passengers, mostly older folks, with tired faces and shopping bags. As we pulled out of the station, the driver, a man with a thick white mustache and a friendly smile, caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "Headed out to Havenwood, son?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I nodded. "First time?" "Yeah," I said. "Got some family there?" He pressed gently. The question hung in the air. Did I? "My grandfather," I said, the words feeling strange. He lived there." "Is that so? What was his name?" "I don't know," I admitted, and the shame of it was a hot flush on my neck. The driver's eyes softened with something that looked like pity, and I hated it. He didn't ask any more questions. The rest of the ride passed in silence as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The bus rumbled down two-lane highways, past fields of corn that seemed to stretch on forever. We drove through a series of small, forgotten towns, each one marked by a grain silo, a water tower, and a handful of shuttered storefronts. Finally, the driver geared down and the bus sighed to a stop in front of a single, lonely gas station with a small, hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome to Havenwood, Pop 412. This was it. This was the place my only inheritance had led me. I grabbed my box and stepped off the bus. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and distant rain. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the hum of the gas station's fluorescent lights. The bus pulled away with a hiss of its air brakes, leaving me alone in the twilight. The gas station attendant, a teenager with headphones around his neck, barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. "Can you tell me how to get to this address?" I asked, showing him the faded tag. He glanced at it. "Old Miller Place. It's a ways out. About a 3-mile walk east of town. Just follow this road. Can't miss it. Big, spooky-looking place on the left. Nobody's lived there for years." "Spooky-looking. Nobody's lived there for years." Mrs. Gable's voice again. "Useless." My heart sank a little further. I thanked him and bought a cheap flashlight, another $1 burning away. Then I started walking. The road out of town had no sidewalks. I walked on the gravel shoulder, my box feeling heavier with every step. The sky darkened from purple to a deep, inky blue, and the stars began to appear, more than I had ever seen in the city. They were bright and cold and impossibly far away. I felt very, very small. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. Set back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown trees and weeds, was a silhouette, a sagging farmhouse, and next to it, the hulking shape of a barn. The place looked abandoned, haunted, just as the kid had said. I stopped at the end of a long, unpaved driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the end of the line. Everything, the hope, the fear, the stupid, impulsive journey had led me to this dark, derelict place. I took a deep breath, the flashlight beam cutting a shaky tunnel through the darkness, and I started walking up the drive. The driveway was more of a suggestion than a path, a pair of ruts choked with weeds that scraped at my jeans. The air grew still and heavy as I moved away from the road, the sounds of the night seeming to hold their breath. The farmhouse loomed in front of me, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. It was a classic 2-story structure, but time had been cruel to it. The paint was peeling in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin. Some of the windows were boarded up, others were dark, empty eyes staring out into the night. A porch sagged tragically to one side, its railing rotted through in several places. I felt a pang of disappointment so sharp it was almost physical. Of course it looked like this. What else could I have expected? This wasn't a home, it was a ruin. I dropped my box on the overgrown lawn and walked up the creaking steps to the front door. The wood groaned under my weight, and I half expected to fall right through. The door was solid wood, its surface weathered and cracked. The knob was missing. I pushed against it, but it didn't budge. I circled the house, my flashlight beam dancing over the decaying walls. I checked every window, every door. Everything was sealed tight, either locked from the inside or boarded over. There was no way in. A part of me was relieved. If I couldn't get in, I could just turn around, walk back to the road, and hitch a ride to somewhere, anywhere else. I could forget this place, forget the key, and get on with the business of surviving. But my gaze drifted to the barn. It stood about 50 yards behind the house, a massive structure whose roofline was a sharp, dark peak against the night. It seemed to be in slightly better shape than the house, its lines straighter, its presence more solid. For Leo, the barn. The tag on the key wasn't for the house, it was for the barn. My feet moved before my mind had caught up, carrying me across the yard. The grass was tall and wet with dew, soaking the cuffs of my pants. As I got closer, the sheer size of the barn was intimidating. It was a giant sleeping in the dark. The main doors were huge, at least 15 feet high, made of thick, weathered planks held together by rusted iron hinges. In the center, where the two doors met, was a heavy iron latch and a massive, formidable-looking padlock. It was old and covered in a thick layer of rust, the color of dried blood. I pulled the key from my pocket. It looked so small and insignificant compared to the lock. This was the moment of truth. Either the key worked and a new set of questions would open up, or it wouldn't, and my journey would end here in this dark, forgotten field. My hand was shaking as I lifted the key to the lock. The flashlight was tucked under my arm, its beam wobbling. I slid the key into the keyhole. It was a tight fit, scraping against the rust inside. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was the wrong size. But then, with a final push, it slid all the way in. It felt like a connection, a circuit being completed across decades. I took a deep breath and turned it. There was a horrible, grating screech of metal on metal, a sound of protest from a mechanism that hadn't moved in years. I had to put my whole body into it, my shoulder braced against the door. The rust fought back. It felt like I was trying to turn a key that had been welded in place. My muscles strained, my teeth gritted. I was about to give up, to accept that this was just another dead end, when I felt a sudden, sharp give. A loud, percussive clack echoed in the silent night. The sound was so abrupt it made me jump. The lock had opened. I pulled the heavy padlock free, its weight surprising me. I set it on the ground and faced the doors. I found a makeshift handle on one of them and pulled. It resisted, its bottom edge scraping against the hard-packed earth. I dug my heels in and pulled with everything I had. Slowly, groaning like a dying beast, the massive door began to move. It opened just enough for me to slip through a dark, narrow opening into the unknown. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the absolute blackness. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the rich, earthy smell of old hay, dry wood, and dust. It was the smell of time itself. My light played across the interior, and I let out a low whistle. The space was cavernous. A central aisle stretched out before me, flanked on both sides by empty animal stalls. High above, massive wooden beams crisscrossed in the darkness, and I could see patches of stars through a few small holes in the roof. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight like tiny, glittering spirits. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust. Old harnesses and tack hung from pegs on the wall, their leather cracked and stiff. A rusty tractor, a relic from another era, sat silently in a corner, its tires long since flattened. It was a cathedral of forgotten work. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. It was eerie, but it wasn't scary. There was a profound sense of peace here, a stillness that felt ancient and sacred. This place had been waiting. I ran my hand along the smooth, worn wood of a stall door. I could almost imagine the life that had once filled this space, the warmth of animals, the smell of fresh hay, the sound of a man's work. My grandfather's work. I felt a connection to him here that I'd never felt before, a sense of his presence in the very dust of this place. I explored for nearly an hour, moving deeper into the barn. In the back, behind a stack of rotting hay bales, I found a small workshop area. A heavy wooden workbench stood against the far wall, covered in old tools, all of them coated in the same layer of rust and dust. There were jars of nails and screws, saws hanging from the wall, and a heavy blacksmith's anvil in the corner. This was a place where things were made, where things were fixed. As my light swept across the floor beneath the workbench, it caught on something. A large, dark green wooden chest, tucked away in the deepest shadows. It was an old sea chest bound with black iron. Straps. It wasn't covered in as much dust as everything else. It had been protected by a heavy canvas tarp that had been draped over it, now stiff with age. My heart started to beat faster. This was different. Everything else in the barn felt like it had been left behind in a hurry, abandoned to time. This chest felt deliberate. It felt like it had been hidden. I knelt and pulled the tarp away. It came off with a dry, crackling sound, releasing a puff of dust. The chest was beautiful, its dark green paint faded but intact. On the front was a heavy brass latch, but no lock. I lifted the latch. My breath held tight in my chest, and I opened the lid. The hinges creaked in protest, the only sound in the silent barn. I aimed my flashlight into the chest's dark interior. For a moment, I thought it was empty. Then the beam settled on the contents, and I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't treasure, not in the way you read about in stories. There was no gold, no jewels. But to me, it was more precious than any of that. On the bottom of the chest lay a thick, yellowed envelope, sealed with wax. On top of it was a stack of money, held together by a simple rubber band. The bills were old, the kind with the smaller portraits. I picked up the stack. My hands trembled. I counted it right there, kneeling on the dusty floor. Tens and twenties. It added up to $2,000. $2,000. To a boy who had only ever known a world of scarcity, who had just been sent out into the world with a meager 500. It felt like a king's ransom. It was survival. It was a buffer against the cold, hard reality I had been facing just hours before. It was a breath of air when I was drowning, but it was the envelope that held my attention. It was addressed to me in a strong, slightly shaky cursive. For Leo. My name. Written by a hand I had never held. My grandfather's hand. I carefully broke the wax seal. The paper was thick and brittle with age. I unfolded it. Inside were two documents. The first was a deed to the property I was standing on, the Miller farm. 20 acres, including the house and barn. And the name on the deed, the owner, was my grandfather, Arthur Miller. My name was Leo Miller. It was the first time I had ever seen my full name written down. A wave of dizziness washed over me. Mrs. Gable had been wrong. The state had been wrong. The property hadn't been sold off. It was still in the family. It was mine. Or it was supposed to be. The second document was a letter. I read it with the flashlight held in my shaking hand, the words swimming before my eyes. My dearest Leo, it began. If you are reading this, then it means I am gone and you have come home. I hope you are 18, a man grown, and that the world has been kinder to you than I was able to be. There is no easy way to say this, so I will say it plain. I failed you. When your mother, my sweet daughter Eleanor, passed away giving birth to you, I was all you had. Your father was never in the picture. I tried, son. For the first 6 months of your life, it was just you and me in that old house. But I was already old, my heart was weak, and my finances were a mess. I was drowning in debt from the medical bills and a few bad investments. I looked at you, this perfect, tiny person, and I saw a life of struggle ahead. I saw a sick old man who couldn't give you the start you deserved. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I gave you up. I told the state I was unfit, that I couldn't provide for you. They took you, and it broke what was left of my heart. But I made a promise to myself that day. I would not leave you with nothing. I spent the last 10 years of my life working this farm, saving every penny I could. I paid off my foolish debts. I fixed the roof on this barn with my own 2 hands. I wanted to make sure that when you came of age, you would have something, a place to stand, a piece of the world that was yours. I had to stop reading. A sob caught in my throat, thick and painful. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the chest, and I cried. I cried for the grandfather I never knew, for the man who had loved me enough to let me go. I cried for the baby I had been, alone in that big house with an old man whose heart was breaking. I cried for the years I had spent feeling like nobody's child, like a piece of unclaimed baggage. He hadn't abandoned me. He had been trying to save me. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and continued reading. This farm is yours, Leo. The deed is in this chest, but there is a complication. To keep the property safe from any lingering creditors and from the state trying to claim it for your upkeep, I had to be clever. There is a substantial lien against the property for back taxes. It's a large sum, more than the cash in this chest. I couldn't pay it off without raising red flags. But I have made arrangements. There is a lawyer in town, a good man named Thomas Abernathy. His office is on Main Street. He was my friend. He holds another letter for you, and he understands the situation. He will help you. The money in this box is for you to live on while you figure things out. It's not much, but it's a start. Be careful, son. There are vultures who have been circling this land for years, developers who want to turn these beautiful fields into cheap houses. They will try to take it from you. Don't let them. This land is your birthright. It is my love for you, made real. The house is locked up tight, but the key to the front door is hidden under the loose stone in the hearth of the barn's old forge. This barn, this was my sanctuary. I hope it can be yours too. Welcome home, Leo. With all my love, your grandfather, Arthur. I read the letter 3 times, the words sinking deeper into me with each reading. Home. He had called it home. I looked around the dark, dusty barn. It wasn't a ruin. It was a sanctuary. It wasn't an inheritance of failure. It was an inheritance of love, of sacrifice, of a desperate, clever plan set in motion a decade ago. The fear I had been carrying since I left St. Jude's was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the fear of being lost and alone. It was the fear of failing the man who had given everything to give me this one chance. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. I went to the old forge in the corner of the workshop. It was a simple brick structure, cold and silent. I ran my hands over the stones of the hearth until I found one that shifted slightly under my touch. I pried it loose with my fingers, and there, nestled in the dark cavity beneath it, was another key, smaller this time and less ornate. The key to the house. I stood up, holding the key in my palm. The barn had given me the past. Now it was time to face the future. I walked out of the barn and back toward the dark, sleeping house, no longer seeing a ruin, but a challenge, a promise, a home. I stood on the sagging porch of the farmhouse. the key to the front door feeling small and cool in my palm. The night was quiet around me, the only light coming from my cheap flashlight and the distant, indifferent stars. For the first time since arriving, I felt a sense of ownership, a terrifying and exhilarating feeling. This was my house, my problem, my chance. The key slid into the lock easily. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a cavern of blackness. The air that rolled out was stale and smelled of dust and forgotten things, but it was different from the earthy smell of the barn. This was the smell of a life interrupted, of a home put to sleep. I stepped across the threshold, my light cutting a path through the gloom. I was in a small entryway. To my left was a staircase leading up into darkness. In front of me was a living room filled with shapes draped in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. I lifted the corner of one sheet. Beneath it was a sturdy, floral-patterned armchair. I moved through the room, unveiling furniture piece by piece, a sofa, a coffee table, a tall bookshelf filled with dusty books. Everything was simple, well-worn, and of good quality. This wasn't the home of a man who had nothing. It was the home of a man who had protected what he had. In the kitchen, I found cupboards stocked with canned goods, their labels faded. There were pots and pans hanging from a rack, all coated in a layer of dust. On the counter sat a ceramic cookie jar in the shape of a smiling pig. I lifted the lid. It was empty. The house was a time capsule, a testament to the day my grandfather had locked the door for the last time, knowing he would never return. It was profoundly sad, but it was also filled with an incredible sense of his presence. I felt like a visitor, an intruder in his life. But his letter had told me otherwise. "Welcome home, Leo." I went upstairs, my footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. There were 2 bedrooms. The first was clearly his, a simple iron bed frame, a tall wooden dresser, and a small writing desk by the window. On the desk was a blotter, an inkwell, and a single unmailed postcard of Havenwood. The other bedroom was smaller. It contained only a single empty crib. My crib. I stood in the doorway of that small room for a long time, my hand on the frame. I tried to imagine him in here, a grieving, lonely old man, looking after a baby he knew he couldn't keep. The weight of his sacrifice pressed down on me. He had given me up not out of weakness, but out of a fierce, protective love. He had endured the pain of separation, the judgment of the state, the loneliness of his final years, all to ensure that this place, this legacy, would be waiting for me. I couldn't let him down. The exhaustion of the day hit me all at once, a physical weight that made my knees feel weak. I went back to the living room, pulled the sheet off the sofa, and lay down without even bothering to take off my shoes. I was too tired to be scared of the dark, too overwhelmed to feel the loneliness. I fell asleep in my grandfather's house, with $2,000 in my pocket and a mountain of debt on my shoulders, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was somewhere I belonged. Now let's pause for a second. If you've made it this far into my story, thank you. It means a lot to share this. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been given something that felt like both a miracle and a terrifying weight? A responsibility that you weren't sure you were ready for, but you knew you had to face. It could be a chance, a secret, or even a person you needed to care for. That's where I was, lying in that dusty house. I had been given a home, but I had also been given a fight I had no idea how to win. If you know that feeling, let me know in the comments. This community is built for people who understand that life's greatest gifts are often the heaviest. Your stories matter just as much as mine. Now let's get back to that farmhouse in Havenwood, because my fight was just beginning. I woke to the sound of birdsong and the sight of dusty sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. For a confused moment, I had no idea where I was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the smell of old wood, the ghostly shapes of the sheet-draped furniture, it all came rushing back. I was in my grandfather's house. I was home. I sat up, my back stiff from sleeping on the lumpy sofa. The initial wave of emotion from the night before had subsided, replaced by a cold, practical dread. I had a deed, but I also had a massive lien for back taxes. I had $2,000, but I had no idea how much the lien was. I had the name of a lawyer, but I had no idea if he was still alive, or if he would even remember a promise made to an old man a decade ago. The first order of business was to get my bearings and make a plan. I spent the morning exploring the property in the daylight. The farm was in a state of beautiful decay. The fields were overgrown with wildflowers and tall grass, but the fence posts were still sturdy. An old apple orchard stood on a gentle slope behind the house, its trees gnarled and untamed, but still dotted with small green apples. The place needed work, a lot of work, but it was good land. I could feel it. The soil was dark and rich. My grandfather had been a farmer, and he had chosen this place for a reason. I ate a can of cold beans I found in the pantry for breakfast, sitting on the front porch steps and looking out over my wild, untamed inheritance. The task ahead seemed impossible. How could one kid with no skills, no money, and no help possibly save this place? The answer was, I couldn't, not alone. I had to trust my grandfather's plan. I had to find Mr. Abernathy. I made myself as presentable as I could, washing my face with water from a rusty hand pump I found behind the house. The water came out brown at first, then cleared to a cold, sweet stream. I put on my cleanest shirt and walked the 3 miles back into town. Havenwood in the daylight was a quiet, sleepy place. The main street had a few shops, a general store, a diner, a post office, and a small single-story brick building with a faded wooden sign that read, Thomas Abernathy, Attorney at Law. A wave of relief washed over me. He was still here. The office was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of books and papers. It smelled of old paper and coffee. A woman with a kind face and a helmet of gray hair sat at a reception desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice sounding younger and more nervous than I wanted. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am. My name is Leo Miller. I think he's expecting me." Her eyes widened slightly at the name. "Miller? Arthur Miller's boy?" I was taken aback. "You knew him?" "Of course, everyone knew Arthur. He was a good man, quiet but good. Just a moment." She disappeared through a door behind her desk. I heard muffled voices, and then she returned, holding the door open. "He'll see you." I stepped into the office. It was even more cluttered than the reception area. Behind a mountain of a desk sat a man who looked as old as the books surrounding him. He was thin and stooped, with a fringe of white hair and thick glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. This was Thomas Abernathy. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice a dry rustle. He gestured to a worn leather chair in front of his desk. "Please, sit. I must admit, I have been wondering when you might arrive." I sat down, my hands clasped nervously in my lap. "You knew I was coming." "Your grandfather was a meticulous man," he said with a faint smile. "He left me with very specific instructions. He told me that on or around your 18th birthday, a young man claiming to be his grandson might walk through my door. He told me to expect you." He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "He also told me about the trouble you'd be in, the farm, the taxes." "The letter said you could help," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It said you'd understand." He nodded slowly. "I do, and I will do what I can. But you need to understand the situation fully, Leo. It's not good." He shuffled through a stack of files on his desk and pulled out a thick one labeled Miller Estate. He opened it and laid out a series of documents. They were covered in official-looking stamps and jargon I didn't understand. "Your grandfather was right," he said, tapping a finger on the top page. "There is a substantial lien on the property for unpaid property taxes. The total amount, with interest and penalties accrued over the last 10 years, is $62,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $62,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. My $2,000 was nothing. It was a joke. The farm was lost. I had come all this way for nothing. "But that's not the worst of it," Abernathy continued, his voice gentle. "For the past 5 years, a development corporation called Viridian Holdings has been buying up land on the outskirts of town. They want to build a major subdivision. Your grandfather's 20 acres are right in the middle of their planned layout. They've been petitioning the county to auction off the property to satisfy the tax lien. So far, I've been able to delay them with legal maneuvering, but my time is running out. They've made a formal offer to the county to buy the property for the exact amount of the taxes owed. If we can't pay that lien in full within 90 days, the farm is theirs." 90 days, $62,000, a faceless corporation breathing down my neck. The weight of it was crushing. I felt the hope that had bloomed in the barn wither and die. "I can't pay that," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't have that kind of money." Abernathy looked at me, his gaze steady. "Arthur knew you wouldn't. He was a proud man, but he wasn't a fool." He reached into a drawer in his desk and pulled out another envelope, this one thick and sealed with the same wax as the first. It had my name on it. "He left this with me. He said I was only to give it to you when you came to me for help, after you had seen the farm for yourself and read his first letter. He said you needed to understand what you were fighting for before you could be given the tools to fight with." He slid the envelope across the desk. It stopped right in front of me. "I don't know what's in it," he said. He never told me, but he believed it was the answer. He believed in you, Leo. I picked up the letter. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like the weight of my grandfather's last hope. I didn't know what could possibly be in it that could solve a $62,000 problem, but as I held it, a tiny, stubborn spark of defiance rekindled in my chest. My grandfather had been a clever man. He had a plan. And this was the next piece of it. I walked back to the farm in a daze, the thick envelope clutched in my hand. The 3-mile walk felt shorter this time, my mind consumed by the contents of the letter and the impossible numbers Mr. Abernathy had laid out. $62,000, 90 days. Viridian Holdings. The words were a grim drumbeat in my head. Yet I wasn't defeated. Not yet. My grandfather had foreseen this. He had anticipated the vultures. This second letter was his final move in a game he had set up a decade ago. I didn't go back to the house. I went to the barn. It already felt like my sanctuary, just as he had hoped. I sat on the edge of the old sea chest, the place where this all began, and I carefully broke the seal on the second letter. The handwriting was the same, but this time it seemed more urgent, the lines more cramped, as if he were running out of time or paper. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have met my old friend Thomas, and you now understand the full scope of the beast we are facing. I know the number he told you sounds impossible. I know you must feel like this is a hopeless fight. But I did not bring you all this way to watch you fail. I told you I had to be clever. Now I will tell you how." I leaned forward, my eyes glued to the page, my heart pounding. The $62,000 tax line is both real and a complete fiction. It is real in the sense that the county records show it. It is a fiction in the sense that the money to pay it has been sitting here, waiting for you all along. I created the debt myself. I read that line again, my mind struggling to comprehend it. He created the debt? How? Why? After I paid off my real debts, the letter continued, I still had a significant amount of savings, money I had put away for your mother's future, and then for yours. If I had simply put it in a bank, the state could have laid claim to it to pay for your years in their care. Or worse, if I had died with it in my name, it would have been eaten by probate fees and taxes, leaving you with pennies. I could not let that happen. So I devised a plan. I created a shell corporation, a simple LLC registered out of state. I called it North Star Holdings. Then I began a process of systematically suing myself. North Star Holdings would place a lien on my property for a fabricated, unpaid debt. Then another. I built a paper trail of financial distress, of a man on the verge of losing everything. The final piece was the property taxes. I stopped paying them. I let the debt accumulate year after year, knowing it was the most secure lien there was. The county would never sell the land for less than the taxes owed, and the amount grew so large that no ordinary person would want it. It became its own fortress, protected by the very debt that seemed to be destroying it. The vultures at Viridian see a piece of land with a crippling lien. They don't see an inheritance, they see a bargain. They are content to wait for the county to foreclose because they believe no one will ever come to claim it. A slow smile spread across my face. It was brilliant. It was the plan of a man who was patient and cunning, a man who had learned to use the system's own cold logic against itself. He hadn't been a failure at all. He had been a protector, a quiet genius. The money, the letter went on, all of it is hidden on this farm. I couldn't risk a bank. I converted it all to cash and gold coins over the years. It is safe. It is yours. You are standing on your inheritance, Leo. Literally. My eyes darted around the barn. Hidden? Where? You remember the old forge in the workshop? The one where you found the house key? Your great-grandfather was a blacksmith. My father. He taught me that the strongest things have the deepest foundations. When he built that forge, he built it to last. And he built it with a secret. Go to the forge. On the side that faces the north wall of the barn, you will find a single stone that is different from the others. It is not brick, but granite. It is the third stone from the bottom, the fifth from the left. Push it, it will not move. Pull it, it will not budge. You must strike it hard in the center with a hammer. Do not be gentle. It is a release mechanism. It will open the way. I dropped the letter and scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran to the workshop, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I found the forge, its dark brick shape, solid and unassuming. I ran my hands along the north-facing side, counting the stones. Third from the bottom, fifth from the left. There it was. A single, smooth, gray granite stone, perfectly set among the rough red bricks. It looked no different from any other, but now that I knew, it seemed to pulse with significance. I found a heavy ball-peen hammer on the workbench, its handle smooth from use. I stood before the stone, the hammer feeling heavy in my hand. Do not be gentle. I took a deep breath, raised the hammer, and swung. It struck the stone with a deafening crack. For a second, nothing happened. I felt a surge of disappointment. Had I misunderstood? Had the mechanism failed after all these years? Then I heard a low grinding sound. A section of the brick floor directly in front of the forge, an area about 3 feet square, began to sink slowly into the ground. It descended about a foot and then stopped, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. I knelt, my hands shaking, and shone my light into the opening. Inside was a heavy steel box, the kind used for ammunition. It was sealed with a simple latch. I reached in, my fingers closing around the cold metal handle, and I lifted it out. It was incredibly heavy. I carried it over to the workbench and set it down with a solid thud. I opened the latch. Inside, neatly wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks and stacks of cash, and beside them, heavy canvas bags that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. I pulled out one of the bags and loosened the drawstring. Gold coins spilled into my palm, gleaming in the flashlight beam. It was real, all of it. He had done it. He had saved it all for me. Tucked into the lid of the box was one final small note. This should be more than enough to pay the wolves at the door and give you a fresh start. Use it wisely. Make a life for yourself, Leo. Be happy. That is all I ever wanted. Your grandfather. I sank to the dusty floor, the gold coins cool and heavy in my hand, and I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, not yet. It was a laugh of disbelief, of shock, of the sheer, overwhelming relief of a man who had been saved from a firing squad at the last possible second. The game had changed. I wasn't the broke orphan anymore. I was the master of the farm, and the wolves had no idea I was coming for them. The next morning, I walked into Mr. Abernathy's office with the steel box in a canvas sack slung over my shoulder. I set it on his desk with a heavy thud that made him jump. "Leo, what is this?" he asked, peering at the bag. I just smiled and opened it. When he saw the contents, the stacks of cash, the bags of gold coins, his jaw dropped. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Good heavens, boy," he whispered. "Arthur, you magnificent old fox." I showed him the second letter. He read it slowly, a look of profound respect and admiration dawning on his face. "He did it," Abernathy said, shaking his head in wonder. "He actually did it. He built a fortress of debt and hid the key in plain sight." For the next 2 hours, we sat in his cluttered office and we made a plan, a real one. The first step was to deal with the money. Mr. Abernathy knew a reputable dealer in Rockford who could convert the gold coins to cash without asking too many questions. He also helped me open a proper bank account, depositing the funds in a way that wouldn't raise immediate red flags with the IRS. We presented it as a recently discovered inheritance, which wasn't far from the truth. The total came to just over $150,000. After sitting in stunned silence for about 10 minutes, staring at the number in my new bank book, the reality of it began to sink in. I was no longer just surviving. I could build something. Our next step was to deal with Viridian Holdings. Mr. Abernathy's eyes twinkled with a certain mischievous glee. "They've been sending me letters every week, a new one just this morning, in fact. Condescending, arrogant things. They assume they're dealing with a dead man's worthless estate. They have no idea the estate just came back to life." Drafted a formal letter to the county tax assessor's office. It stated that the estate of Arthur Miller, represented by his sole heir, Leo Miller, was prepared to pay the outstanding tax lien of $62,000 in full. He enclosed a cashier's check. Then he drafted a second letter, this one to the legal department of Viridian Holdings. It was a masterpiece of polite, legalistic savagery. It informed them that their interest in the Miller property was no longer welcome, that the tax lien which formed the basis of their claim was being satisfied, and that any further attempts to contact me or to trespass on my property would be met with swift legal action. "How does that sound?" he asked, a wide grin on his face. "It sounds perfect," I said, feeling a sense of empowerment I had never known. We sent the letters that afternoon. The next few days were a blur of activity. With Mr. Abernathy's help, I got the deed officially transferred into my name. I was Leo Miller, landowner. I used some of the money to buy a beat-up but reliable pickup truck from a used car lot in Rockford. I bought new clothes that actually fit, work boots, heavy gloves, and a mountain of cleaning supplies. And then I went to work. I started with the house. I spent a week just cleaning. I scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and beat the dust out of the old rugs. I took down the white sheets, letting the sunlight flood the rooms. With every bit of dust and grime I cleared away, it felt like I was clearing away the neglect and sadness of the past 10 years. The house began to breathe again. It started to feel less like a museum and more like a home. I moved my few belongings from the box into the dresser in my grandfather's, no, my bedroom. I slept in his bed. It felt right. After the house was clean, I turned my attention to the land. I bought a heavy-duty mower and spent days cutting back the overgrown fields, rediscovering the contours of the land my grandfather had worked. I found the old vegetable garden, now a patch of determined weeds, and I started the back-breaking work of tilling the soil, preparing it for a future planting. The work was hard, physical, and exhausting. I would come in every evening covered in dirt and sweat, my muscles aching. But it was a good ache. It was the feeling of building something with my own two hands. I was earning my place here. About a week after we sent the letters, I got a phone call. It was Mr. Abernathy. "You're not going to believe this," he said, and I could hear the laughter in his voice. I just got off the phone with a very angry, very confused lawyer from Viridian. He wanted to know who Mr. Leo Miller was. He wanted to know where the money came from. He even tried to suggest some kind of fraud was involved. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that my client's finances were none of his concern. I told him the farm was not for sale, not now, not ever, and then I wished him a very nice day and I hung up." I learned something important in that moment. The world is full of bullies, big and small. Corporations like Viridian, they count on people being scared. They count on them being poor and alone and powerless. They never expect you to fight back. My grandfather had known that. He had given me not just the money, but the means to stand up for myself. He had armed me for the fight. The biggest change, however, was not the money or the farm. It was inside me, the hollow, aching feeling of being an orphan, of being adrift in the world, was slowly starting to fade. It was being replaced by something new, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection, a sense of peace. One evening, I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields I had just mowed. The air was cool and the sky was a blaze of color. I thought about my grandfather, and for the first time, it wasn't with a sense of sadness or loss. It was with a profound sense of gratitude. He had given me more than a farm. He had given me a backstory. He had given me a family, even if it was just the memory of one man. He had shown me that I came from somewhere, that I belonged to someone. The rusty barn key had not been a piece of junk. It had been the key to my entire life. It had unlocked the past, and in doing so, it had opened the door to my future. I still had a long way to go. The house needed repairs, the barn needed a new roof, and the fields needed to be planted. But for the first time in my 18 years, I wasn't scared. I was home, and I was ready to get to work. Months turned into a year. The rhythm of the seasons became the rhythm of my life. In the spring, I tilled the old garden, and with advice from a friendly neighbor who ran the local feed store, I planted my first crop of tomatoes, corn, and squash. I was clumsy at first, all thumbs and uncertainty, but I learned. I learned how the soil felt in my hands, how to read the clouds for rain, how to tell a weed from a seedling. When the first green shoots pushed their way up through the dark earth, I felt a surge of pride that was more satisfying than any dollar amount in my bank account. I was creating life. I was continuing my grandfather's work. I spent the summer tending to the garden, fixing fences, and giving the farmhouse a fresh coat of white paint. The house stood proud now, no longer a ruin but a landmark. I even managed to fix the sagging front porch, replacing the rotted boards with new wood. Every swing of the hammer felt like I was driving a nail into the coffin of my past life. the life of a boy with no name and no future. I was building, repairing, and in the process, I was healing myself. I became a familiar face in Havenwood. I bought my groceries at the general store, had breakfast at the diner on Saturday mornings, and always stopped to chat with the people I met. They were wary at first, this quiet city kid who had suddenly taken over the old Miller place. But they were also kind. They saw the work I was putting in. They saw the farm slowly coming back to life, and they started to accept me. An old farmer named Bill taught me how to tune up the ancient tractor in the barn. The feed store owner's wife gave me her grandmother's recipe for tomato sauce. Mr. Abernathy would stop by once a month with a bag of pastries, and we'd sit on the porch and talk for hours. I was no longer just Leo, the orphan. I was Leo Miller, the boy who was fixing up his granddad's farm. I had an identity. I had a community. When autumn came, I harvested my first crop. The yield was modest, but to me, it was a miracle. I had turned seed and soil and sun into food. I sold most of it at a local farmer's market, and the small wad of cash I made from it felt more valuable than the fortune hidden in the forge, because I had earned it. I had made it with my own hands. That winter was the first I had ever spent outside of an institution. It was quiet and cold. I spent the long evenings by a crackling fire in the living room fireplace, reading the books from my grandfather's shelf. He had books on farming, on history, on poetry. I felt like I was getting to know him through the pages he had turned, the passages he had underlined. I learned that he was a man who loved the land, who believed in hard work, and who had a quiet, deep appreciation for the beauty of the world. One snowy evening, I found an old photo album tucked away in the back of a closet. The pictures were black and white, their corners faded, and there he was. Arthur Miller, a young man with a serious face and kind eyes, standing proudly in front of the barn. There were pictures of him on the old tractor, pictures of him with a prize-winning pig, pictures of him standing with a young woman with a beautiful, bright smile, my grandmother, and then, a few pages later, a picture of a younger woman with the same smile, holding a baby, my mother, Eleanor, and me. I stared at that photo for a long time, my finger tracing the outline of her face. It was the first time I had ever seen her. She was beautiful, and she was smiling at me. In that moment, sitting in the warm, quiet house with the snow falling outside, I felt the final piece of my heart click into place. The hole that had been there for as long as I could remember, the one shaped like a family, was finally full. I wasn't just the grandson of Arthur Miller. I was the son of Eleanor Miller. I was part of a line. I had roots that went deep into the soil of this farm. The inheritance my grandfather had left me wasn't the money or the land or the house. Those were just the tools. His real gift was this story. He had given me a past, and in doing so, he had given me the power to build my own future. He had taught me that home isn't just a place you are given. It's a place you build. It's a place you fight for. It's a place you earn. He taught me that sometimes the greatest acts of love look like abandonment, and the greatest treasures are hidden behind walls of debt and decay. Life on the farm is still hard. There are days when I feel lonely and days when the work feels endless. The scars from my past haven't vanished completely. They are a part of who I am. But they no longer define me. When I look out over my fields now, I don't see a struggle. I see a legacy. I see a promise kept. I see a future growing green and strong from the ground up. And I know with a certainty that settles deep in my bones that I am finally, truly home. My story started with a key to a place I didn't know, from a family I couldn't remember. It was a story that could have ended on a bus station bench, another forgotten kid aged out of the system. But a choice, a single, stupid, hopeful choice to follow that one thin thread changed everything. I wanted to share this with you because I know so many of us are handed stories about ourselves that we didn't ask for. Stories of being not good enough, of being alone, of coming from nothing. But those aren't the only stories. We have the power to find the hidden letters, to unlock the forgotten doors, and to find the truth of who we are, buried under the rubble of our past. Your inheritance might not be a farm. It might be a talent you've ignored, a relationship you can still mend, or a strength inside you that you've never been taught to use. Whatever it is, I hope you find the courage to claim it. Thank you for letting me share my home with you. If this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing. This channel is a place for stories like ours, a community for people who are building their own homes, literally and figuratively. And in the comments, I'd love for you to tell me, what's the one thing you've inherited, a quality, a story, a memory, or a dream that has helped you build your own life? I'll be reading every single one, because every story of finding home deserves to be told.